I like to be innovative and try new things. The way I see it, even if I fail, there's a good chance that through that failure, I will still learn something new, and that's still good, right? Also, who knows? Maybe something I do will change the world one day. Now, I'm not saying this project is going to change the world, but it will change the way I use epoxy in some of my future projects. Plus, it might also inspire you to try something new with epoxy. And that's something that would be cool for both of us. You probably didn't know this, but I'm a night owl, and for anyone out there who doesn't know what that is, it just means I prefer to stay up till the early hours of the morning working versus waking up at the crack of dawn. I always seem to do my best thinking at night while the rest of the world, well, at least the rest of the world around me, is sleeping. For example, the idea for this project started over 7 months ago while I was randomly looking at things that no one really needs on Amazon late one night. I mean, does anyone really need an inflatable Adirondack chair? Anyway, the links to everything you need to get started on this project are down below, just in case it's 3 a.m. where you live and you decide you want to try something new for yourself. And of course, I'll leave a link for the inflatable Adirondack chair if you feel like you need to be one of the few people in the world who owns one. But like I was saying, over 7 months ago, late one night, I came across this rubber molding stuff that looks like rock on one edge. From what I could gather, it's used to make the edges on concrete countertops look like, well, rock. And while I have made a couple of concrete tops in the past, with varied success, and I would be grateful if you watched those videos next, I really had the urge to try something new that had never been done before. So here I am, 7 months later, cleaning up this slab of elm. Now, just because I like to try new things doesn't mean there isn't a certain level of fear involved. For one, I post all these projects online for the entire world to see and judge, and people do judge. Money was also a small factor for this project. This rubber molding, the epoxy, elm slab, fancy legs are not exactly cheap. But in reality, I had two other major concerns when I started this project. First, could I make a mold that wouldn't leak? And second, would the epoxy stick to this rubber molding stuff? If the mold leaks or this stuff sticks, this project could be a disaster and a total waste of money. But in the end, I decided that some people would like to see a disaster as much as they would like to see this work. So in theory, it could be a win-win, right? Go ahead and give me a thumbs up if you want to see a disaster over the next few minutes, or just subscribe if you hope it all works out. This lets me know which side of the fence you're on. Either way, I could have tested this off camera first, but I didn't. So let's find out how this turns out together. Now, I didn't want the mold to leak, and since this rubber molding is expensive, I didn't want to cut a piece off. Unfortunately, these two things don't really jive because if I don't cut the rubber molding, it will be sticking out of the melamine mold on each side. But hey, since we're trying new things, I figured let's just see what happens here. Now, by my calculations, if I use enough silicone caulk to seal everything, then there's nothing that could possibly go wrong. One key to all of this working was adhering the rubber molding to the bottom and back side of the melamine mold using a lot of caulk. Then I used a clamp to squish each side of the rubber molding between the left and right side of the melamine mold. I also decided to use screws instead of nails to provide some extra strength. Finally, I just sealed it with an obscene amount of silicone caulk just to be sure. I will end up cutting the ends off the table later, if everything goes as planned of course, so I can afford to be a little messy here. And since I was really worried about the epoxy sticking to this stuff, I put about 4 coats of silicone mold release on this entire thing, then buffed it in with a rag to complete each application. The only thing to do now, after waiting for about 2 days for the caulk to set up, is mix up about $100 worth of epoxy, go for broke, and finally see if I'm going to have a leaky disaster on my hands, or be thrilled that my mold didn't leak. I see a lot of people who rush while mixing their epoxy. They end up with sticky or soft spots in their final piece that will never fully cure. I never really understood why they rush the mixing process. There's nothing about epoxy projects that is fast. So Just take your time. This super clear liquid glass deep pour resin, for example, takes 3 or more days to cure. You could literally mix this stuff for an hour or more, and it would still pour just fine. Now, I mixed this epoxy really well, and spoiler alert, it was fully cured when I came back to unmold it 10 days later. But I did make what I thought at the time was a critical mistake. The color of the epoxy that I wanted was more of a darker smoke color, along with hints of pearlescence. But as you can see here while I'm pouring it, the epoxy is pretty light in color. I didn't want to try to add more pigment at this point, so I just popped the bubbles with a blowtorch and decided I would just go with it and hope for the best. And actually, if I wouldn't have said anything to you, you would have never known that the color of this epoxy wasn't the color that I was going for on this project. However, I still told you, so you can also trust me when I say this mold didn't leak 1 drop of epoxy. And that isn't a sarcastic joke. This thing actually held up perfectly. Everything about this project seemed to take longer than normal. 7 months to get started, 10 days to take it out of the mold, and honestly, I was terrified that the epoxy was going to stick to the rubber molding. I already had a backup plan to, quote, turn lemons into lemonade. I was just gonna cut the rubber mold off the edge of the epoxy if it was sticking, ultimately saving this table and showing you that even a disaster can turn out okay. But to my surprise, the rubber mold came off pretty easy, and I was able to keep it in 1 long strip. Now, I really don't know if epoxy just won't stick to this molding stuff, or if the excessive amounts of silicone mold release was the key, but hey, whatever, it worked. And speaking of taking a long time, while also making a complete mess, the only option I had available to flatten this tabletop was a homemade router sled and a flattening bit. You don't always need the most fancy tools to do the job, but who am I kidding? A CNC machine would be really nice right now. By the way, did you know that routers are designed to cut in one direction, and that one direction is counterclockwise? For some reason, I think people completely forget this when they use a router sled. They push the router away from themselves, move the sled over, and pull the router back towards themselves, making a cut in each direction. Then they post the same question on every online forum known to man and router sledding. Why am I getting chip out when using my router sled? Well, in most cases, they are using the router incorrectly. The correct way to use a router sled is to push or pull it so it's only cutting in a counterclockwise direction. Making a cut with a router clockwise, also known as a climb cut, is actually making the router cut in the wrong direction, and this increases the odds of chip out, especially with epoxy. Next, I needed to cut the top down to size, but as you can see here, there is no way I can run this through the table saw since the epoxy edge looks like rock and it isn't straight. I decided that since I don't have a track saw, this sketchy idea to glue a straight piece of plywood to my top using some masking tape and CA glue was my best option, but maybe not the safest option. I also decided to put a slight bevel on the bottom edge of each wood side to give this top a little more character and class. I also used my favorite 1/8 inch roundover bit to knock down the corners on the top. Finally, I take a good amount of time to fill all the little tiny air bubbles and voids in the epoxy using some CA glue and cheap paint brushes. You know what else takes a long time? Sanding. I decided to use a different finish on this project, which I'll show you here in a minute, but to get the best results with this product, I need to sand this top down to 320 grit. And while most woodworkers, myself included, don't enjoy sanding, it is one thing that can make or break a project. There are a few things you can do to get better results while sanding. One is use a high quality sandpaper like this 3M Extract mesh paper. One downside to any mesh paper is it quickly renders the Velcro pad on your sander useless because of all of the dust that collects on it. Recently, I found these Festool underpads, specifically designed to be used with mesh sandpaper. These act like a buffer between the Velcro pad and the sandpaper. Not only will your sandpaper stick much better to these, but it also keeps your Velcro pad on your sander safe from harm. Now, unless you're going for a high gloss finish on epoxy, you can actually get a really good finish by only sanding with 120 grit. But you didn't hear that from me. However, this should be your goal, to get a perfect, hazy, sanding finish free of swirls with every single grit of sandpaper you use before you move on. Oh, and hooking your sander up to a vacuum is the only way to go. Look how much dust there is before I turn the vacuum on, and then how much cleaner it is after. Speaking of moving on, by now you are probably thinking of clicking off this video because you can't stand to hear another word about sanding. But before you do, I want to show you this new finish I found at the Urban Lumber Company in Kansas City, Missouri. It's a mixture of boiled linseed oil, polyurethane, Japan dryer, and mineral spirits. First off, I love the way that a hard wax finish like Rubio makes the grain pop, and since Rubio is basically glorified boiled linseed oil, this new finish has me covered. The kicker is this new finish also has some oil-based polyurethane mixed in, and poly is one of the most durable finishes that you can apply to wood. So between the pop of the boiled linseed oil and the protection of the poly, I feel like I'm getting the best of both worlds here. The mineral spirits thins it down to make it easy to buff on and buff off with the shop rag. The Japan dryer just helps it cure quicker, so I can do multiple coats in a day, only waiting 4 to 6 hours between each coat. Also between each coat, you want to do a light sanding with some 320 grit sandpaper. And after 3 or 4 coats, I ended up with this beautiful durable finish that feels great to the touch and will stand up to daily use. There's only one thing left to do with this table, and that's give it some legs. I purchased these beautiful legs from Flowy Line Designs. Now, typically I like to inlay the base of the table legs into the table, but this piece wasn't super thick, and I didn't want to see the base through the lighter colored epoxy. And that's why I decided to attach these legs directly to the underside of the table for this application. I saw a really detailed video a while back that showed how these metal threaded inserts are not as strong as just tapping the wood, and you know what? I'm okay with that. These inserts are plenty strong for this table. Plus, in the long run, if this table needs to be taken apart and moved multiple times, I still think the metal threaded inserts are a better option. After drilling the holes for the inserts, I like to touch them up with this countersink bit. This accounts for the small lip on the threaded inserts. Then you can just take an Allen wrench and slowly screw them in place. Now add the legs and bolt them right into place. I still have one last question for you. Do you like the color of this epoxy? Let me know in the comments down below what you think, or let me know what color you would have used if you were making this project. I personally fell in love with this frosted look, and I would actually do it all over again, given the chance. But I really want to know what you think. Also, just remember, you can DIY, build it yourself. Did I mention YouTube is convinced you're also going to like the video that just popped up on your screen? Go ahead and check it out while you place your order for an inflatable Adirondack chair, and as always, thanks for watching.